Okay, very well. Let's start. We will see the rest coming in the meantime. So we are very pleased that today we can we hold this webinar, which is focused around a new type of work that Counterbalance is doing. Counterbalance is a network of European NGOs working on public investment of the European Union. Our historical subject has always been the European Investment Bank, but since in the last years, there has been many different types of new EU public investments, such as the Recovery Fund or InvestEU or the Global Gateway on the international level. Our scope has also expanded with this new development on the policy level. What we are looking at today is a bit a new road for Counterbalance, which, like, historically we worked a lot on either this case in this country, which is where there is a problem, where the local population has a complaint or etc., or on the climate policy of, for example, European Investment Bank or human rights breaches. What we now started to do with the work we are presenting today is a bit more, let's say, on the business model. What is the strategy? What is the more general strategy that the EU public investment is following? And we are really looking at from the point of view, is this public money, which in the end is all comes from taxpayer money, is this fulfilling the first priority, the needs of people of the households? And for this, we commissioned a research to the Foundational Economy Collective, and we have Karel Williams, who is the co-author of the report, and the report Things Have to Change. You can find it on our website. He will present the report, and he is also the director of the Foundational Economy Collective. And then later we will have two presentations who will react on the report, and we have Daniela Gabor, who is a professor of economics and macrofinance at the University of West of England, but has a temporary position in the US. I didn't understand exactly which one it is, but maybe she will tell us herself. She has a due desk in any way in the US, and she has a lot of experience working on what is de-risking, on how public money is being used a lot to make investments which need to serve some public purpose, but to make sure that they become attractive for private investors and all the problems that come with this. She will react from this perspective. And then we have Lucía Martín González, who will talk more about more practical experience, because she was, until last May, she was a city councillor in Barcelona for Barcelona and Comú on housing. And at this moment, which I just learned now, she's not this councillor for housing at the moment anymore, because in Barcelona, there's still government information. Let me maybe also say that this is a project that is part of a broader, it's a Counterbalance and ODG and Recommon, and also Bankwatch, which are three of our members, with which we have a project together looking at the EIB, the Recovery Fund, and InvestEU, and we look at in what ways do they contribute to a just transition and to a equal recovery from the pandemic. Then I will give the floor to, sorry, let me also say that in the meantime, first we will have the presentation, 15 minutes of Karel, then 10 minutes of Daniela and Lucia each. And afterwards, there can be some debate between them. And at 4, we reserve a half an hour for Q&A. So you can use the Q&A session to already write questions or comments you may have. And then when we are ready, we will deal with the questions. There will be enough time. And when we open up the Q&A session, you can also raise your hand, and you can also ask a question live. All right, then let me give the floor to Karel, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. then let's see if we can get the technology to work. That looks good. Right. Is everybody happy with that, Frank? Yes? Yeah. Okay. On we go. I'm going to give a broad summary of the report that we wrote for Frank, and I'm one of 5 authors of the report, so I'll do my best to represent their subtleties. The thing rests on really a contrast between 2 framings. The EU framing, which is an elite framing about making the economy work again, which combines, we argue, the statecraft end of elites retaining power with the kind of economics that they understand, which proposes supply-side interventions, which leads them to persist with the irrelevant and the undeliverable. And the alternative is the foundational framing of making the household, not the economy, making the household work again, starting from the cost of living crisis as a crisis of livability, saying what we have to do is to improve livability and incidentally underpin liberal democracy. And this is quite a challenging shift intellectually and politically, because the elites want to do something different. So I'm going to talk first about the EU framing for half my time. And the issue here really is, how is the EU money strategically disposed, and what is the money doing? Think in terms of the strategy. This business of statecraft is the end. And statecraft is ultimately about keeping the same people in charge at the top of society. If I'd wanted to be academic in the report, I could have cited James Bulpitt's classic article on Thatcherism, where Jim argued that the people had read Thatcher in 2 ways, either as being a neoliberal conspiracy or really smart improvisation. But there was a 3rd way of looking at it as well, which was to see it as being about the same people being in charge from the center. Because that was a bit English, I actually used Tancredi Falconeri from the Leopard novel, who had this lovely line in the Risorgimento about everything must change so that everything can stay the same. So that there is this sense that elites embrace change so that they can continue to be in charge. And of course, they need then technocratic consiglieri. And I think a certain kind of technocentric centrist economics supplies the means, a high economics from the center. Now, with Daniela on the call, I wouldn't want to argue that high economics doesn't matter. And it certainly matters in that you can make major mistakes and you can fail to reform finance and any number of things, but it's also associated with a good deal of bullshit and pretension about what can be achieved by high economics. And here, in this case, the politicians lean on an economics with a cake mix concept of the economy, where you add the right ingredients, you generate growth and all the rest of that. And this is rather curious because statecraft ends, technocentric means, and it's all failing quite spectacularly as part of the great moving right show. Meloni, the Hesse and Bavarian elections this week, and nothing to come after Macron but Le Pen or an alternative. And so I think that's the framing, the statecraft end and the technocratic means. The supply side intervention, it used to be for growth through infrastructure. Now it's green and digital technologies to produce a shiny, shiny base. There's lots of money being borrowed, next generation, 700 billion euro, as well as the standard structural budget. And it's quite interesting that in the national plans, which have to be approved, the only quantified objectives are growth, employment, and productivity. That's an absolutely important point. And then some minimum requirements that you spend it in green and digital ways. The EIB, I think, is relatively boring in this, in it's the faithful servant of EU priorities. It looks for investable projects, and it is the master of risk aversion. 60% of its loans go to corporates and banks using standard DCF criteria. Then the other aspect of it is publicly guaranteed using relaxed criteria. The risk of default is very low given DCF and public guarantees. And when you look at it, the surprising thing is that although, of course, the shareholder value performance is much weaker, in return on assets or interest on customer loans, it looks much the same as a kind of retail bank, which is, of course, also engaged in avoiding risk one way or another. Now, that's a very quick run through what statecraft end and technocentric economics actually produces. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, what's wrong, issue one, is this green growth stuff. If you shift from saying policy needs to produce growth to produce green growth, that raises the bar, because broadly speaking, growth and emissions are relatively but not absolutely decoupled. You get less emissions per quantum of growth than you did in the 1980s or the 1990s, but still increased output means increased emissions. So the green objective, the green growth objective, is problematic. The other thing is a flawed innovation model. About the idea is that you scale cleaner, cheap technology without regard to how citizens use technology. This is absolutely crucial debate at present in studies of technology. And those who are concerned with how people use technology are concerned with a rebound effect, which we see from home insulation, where people have more comfortable homes instead of less gas usage. And we could expect that cheap energy would, for example, produce an aircon boom in Southern Europe. It's also quite clear the household benefits from growth, from more higher wage jobs, are uncertain, because the productivity gains can be captured by capital in the form of higher profits, not wages. And it's not clear that there are lots of good jobs here. When one says all of this against green growth, the Nordic ideal lingers in people's minds. So I always put up this one, which shows ecological footprint, which shows that societies like Sweden and Denmark of high mass consumption are also societies with a gross ecological footprint. Issue one is this green growth delusion. Issue two is what's outside the frame, a very narrow field of the visible, because the preoccupation with supply side investable projects leads to an emphasis on high profile transformative tech, AI, life sciences, space, green hydrogen, battery factories, and all the rest of that. It's one-sided in that it leads to a preoccupation with climate, not nature emergency, because you can't package species diversity as an investable project so easily. It fixates, I think, very much on business emissions rather than household emissions, where insulating homes is only part of the problem. And it has a very thin concept of the social, which is either upskilling the workforce to support economic growth, or technical fixes like healthcare, which is very important, is about hospitals and life sciences for the EU, not about public health and prevention. So I think it's ill-judged objectives in green growth and a very narrow field of the visible. So I'm going to talk now very briefly for 7 minutes or so about the foundational framing. And I think if you actually think about foundational thinking, what we're trying to do is to rethink the economy as a verb, so to speak. The question is, what does the economy do? What should it do for senior lives that we have reasons to value? It doesn't produce welfare or anything of that sort. It produces preconditions of senior freedom. And I think the economy, from that point of view, needs to generate household livability, responsible and capable suppliers, all within planetary limits. Households rather than individuals, because although economics hasn't really noticed, 70% of us live in multi-person households with expenditure and income sharing, which is absolutely crucial to understanding patterns of poverty and affluence, because two-wage earners are absolutely essential at the bottom end of North European society, and professors marrying professors and such like explains why people get into decile 9 and 10 at the top of the income distribution. If we then start to think about household livability, there are 3 pillars: residual income after paying for essentials, not gross wages or disposable income, but what you have left after paying for housing, food, utilities, and transport, basic services like health, education, and care, and social infrastructure, because we are all social animals. Now, the interesting thing is this gives you a kind of need for 3-dimensional thinking. And as soon as you start thinking 3-dimensional, you also realize that if livability has 3 pillars, services, infrastructure, and residual income, all 3 pillars are crumbling. If you look at the problems, yesterday's solutions, today's problems with the material infrastructure, when housing, energy, and transport account for more than half of EU emissions. If you think about pipe and cable systems or the welfare services, complicated by austerity, underfunding, and privatization and outsourcing. All of that needs rebuilding or upgrading. Social infrastructure is very interesting because it's the thing that people always tell us they want when we do community surveys, but it's seldom been a considered object of public policy. It's always been a matter of trickle down from central and local government having discretionary surpluses, and these get harder to find. Residual income, well, government policy on tax and benefits shapes disposable income, and in most West European countries, the poor lose out because they lose benefits as well as paying taxes when they get a pay increase. And there's also then this whole problem with residual income for deductions for essentials like housing, utilities, and transport. Now, I could go on for a whole afternoon about deductions for essentials, but the point I want to make immediately is the cost of living crisis is an acute crisis of squeezed residual income. We did a paper on this on the Foundational Economy.com website a couple of months ago. That's to say the cost of living crisis is whether people have anything left over or negative income after paying for the FE4 essentials of housing, food, utilities, and transport. And for 6 European countries, we looked at the position of residual income for the bottom 18 to 25%. We couldn't do it more precisely than 18 to 25% because the publicly available figures are in quintiles, quartiles, sixths, and deciles. But pre-crisis, for the people who are in the bottom 20-25% of society, FE4, the basics, always took around half and near 3/4 in Italy and Germany, where the pre-crisis monthly residual income was no more than 300, 400 euros, which is very small indeed. Then if you look from this column, which gives you the pre-crisis share of the basic for necessities, housing, food, utilities, and transport in net household income. You shift to the figures in brackets, that shows our calculations for late 2022. And as you see, the energy spike and food price inflation increases the share of essentials by up to 11%. 11% is actually achieved in the UK, and in Germany and Italy, it produces absolutely crisis level in that the people at the bottom of society are spending 4/5 of their income on these 4 essentials, and their residual income is being exceedingly squeezed. Could go on and on about this, but I want you to look at this column of housing as percentage of total spend and compare that housing accounts for 20% of net household income in Austria in 2019 and in adjacent Germany for 40%. This illustrates the crucial importance of the housing settlement and relatively low housing costs in making sure that people have a margin of residual income after paying for the essentials. Now, if that's the basic analysis, the 3 pillars of livability, a residual income, it's social infrastructure, essential services, and residual income is powerfully influenced by housing, we've seen, then the next stage in the argument is don't expect too much from the upper levels of national and EU government. Because to begin with, much is uncontrollable. Nature and climate emergency, pandemic threat, debt-based finance, geopolitical rivalries. Nobody can predict the timing and nature of the next shock. With this week's Hamas attack on Israel, I think that should be very obvious to everybody. And of course, crises lead to essentially a break on austerity and an uncritical splashing of the cash, usually on the basis that the middle classes also need our support. There is, of course, not simply a large realm of the uncontrollable, there's a realm of the controllable, but it's very difficult to capture and change high-level frameworks. Risk-averse officers, opportunist politicians, inattentive and superficial publics, and capitalist lobbyists defending the status quo. Of course, this is like high economic policy. Of course, it matters. But you can't suppose you can simply, easily control it to get the result that you want. We shouldn't ignore, we can't bypass higher level government because it's a protection from worse scoundrels and it's got resources in silos. But I do think that if you actually want action to improve livability, then most of it will have to start from where you're at a regional and local level, and it will involve what in foundational thinking we call adaptive reuse, borrowed from Lacaton and Vassal, the French architects who, of course, don't knock down modernist tower blocks, but revamp them so that they can be reused for another 50 years. And I think much of the improvements comes from local disruptors, one municipality at a time, one activity at a time, from inside government, from outside government, depending on political alliances and understanding foundational priorities and possibilities. And this involves analysis of the problem, know-how about levering change, and understanding limits set by costs. And I think these issues shouldn't be underestimated because so much of policy actually from top down tries to short circuit these kind of material local conditions. The classic recent European example would obviously be this super bonus scheme in Italy, which offered, middle-class householders money to install double glazing. And I think...
Excuse me, Karel?
Yes,
Could you
I'm finishing.
finish in 1 minute?
Yes. We don't need to ask permission to start foundational projects. All your regions across Europe have projects. And I think if you then say, how does this kind of bottom-up relate to what we know about top-down, I think the answer is to basically go into the sweet spot where elite priorities and household priorities overlap, which is especially housing, energy inefficient housing, particularly where you can have local organization, not just financial bungs, the importance of housing settlements, which make housing affordable and controlling housing costs, because that gives us leverage over residual income. And in the many cases of low wages, the importance of social housing. So, I mean, they leave you with the idea of a Venn diagram overlap between the circle of local and regional household priorities and elite priorities. And that ends the presentation.
Great, Karel. Thank you very much for the presentation of the research you made for us. It definitely makes me, your story definitely makes me think of what we saw in this summer, that at the same time, the Eurobarometer, which comes out every now and then, asking European citizens about their opinion about a number of topics, and the Commission publishing in the same week a strategic foresight report about what they see as challenges and things that are important for the Union, where in the Eurobarometer, the cost of living crisis was seen as really one of the first main issues on the heads of on the mind of people. And that even though this strategic foresight report of the Commission mentioned in its analysis this problem and actually raised a number of the issues that you also raise, in the solutions, this was nowhere to be found. However, all these technological fixes, etc., were very present. So maybe let's now go on to Daniela Gabor for a first reaction. And from the body of your work that we know, we were wondering actually, like, do you consider it possible to finance the financial economy and its emphasis on essential public services in what you call the actual moment where we find ourselves, what you call the de-risking state? And if it's not possible, then why not? And maybe also, like, you argue more for like a big green state, and you can maybe quickly say what you mean with this, and how do you think that this would enable us better to provide these kind of services that Karel has been talking about?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Karel, and the co-authors. I thought this report was fascinating, and I would encourage everybody to read it. Everybody who thinks about questions of climate, who thinks through questions of social justice and just transitions, I think it's a very clear mapping of what are the stakes and how do we think politically about those stakes. And let me maybe start first by saying what I understood from where I come from, of what is the proposal that this report has in kind of political strategy. And I think I took it that Karel and his co-authors are advising us, you know, to not bother with occupying the commanding heights of the economy, which is a kind of phrase from the early 20th century, I guess, from socialists, but not only, who thought about how to reform capitalism. And the idea was, you know, the idea to me is the commanding heights of the economy at the moment are how do, the elite that Karel talked about, the financial sector, the green sectors in clean tech, but not only, and obviously politicians in government. And the way that I read the argument was to say that we really, progressives of whatever nature, we cannot make much of a difference at that level because, in a sense, capital and the state are very closely aligned together, and this alignment would not create or will not allow for any kind of strategic opportunities. So we have to think smaller in some ways, or we have to think local, and we have to think about, you know, like specific opportunities at local level where you have creative politicians working with civil society organizations to kind of carve out small spaces where the foundational economy or this foundational logic can be adopted as a logic of organizing local projects. And I just want to very quickly diagnose where I think we are, where are these commanding heights, or what is happening in the relationship between state and capital, and the European Investment Bank is a very useful example of that, and that's why I think the report is very important, because what we have seen, and this is where my work comes, or my work looks at, what we have seen is a much closer realignment between the state and capital, particularly financial capital, up to a couple of years ago, but now industrial capital as well, with the turn to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the turn to, you know, fighting the geopolitical pressure to fight against China's basically takeover of most clean tech value chains across global clean tech value chains. And so this alignment between the state and capital is very, I think it's very real, and it extends very much into the kind of areas that Karel has been talking about, and the project to create investable these partnerships between state and capital to create investable projects doesn't only focus on clean tech, but it focuses on infrastructure as an asset class. And infrastructure there kind of covers most of the things that Karel discussed: housing, it covers health, it covers basically nature, biodiversity, everything. You know, the logic of public policy, I think it's undergoing a very profound transformation, in the sense that the state has a starting point, and that's where I agree with Karel that we should blame mainstream economists. The starting point is that we don't have enough public money to do public investment, that the fiscal space is kind of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking for a variety of reasons. And therefore, what you have to do is you have to crowd in private capital or mobilize private capital. And the range of things for which private capital is mobilized is expanding. And of course, one of the most visible ones, and where Lucía, I'm sure, will be touching on, is in housing. And housing as an asset class has become a project that is in many ways quite insidious and quite powerful, both at national and at European level. So I would say, yes, that this is the political reality in which we find ourselves. I have some doubts about the idea that this political strategy should be very much local rather than national or European, for two reasons. And the first one is, it reminded me, your talk, Karel reminded me of Fred Bloch's The Ruling Class Does Not Rule, where he makes this argument, you know, that capitalists are not, we shouldn't think that capitalists are completely in charge of the state or completely in charge of distribution, because in exceptional circumstances, the state has to do a lot, bow into political pressure and do a lot more than simply do the bidding of capital. And I have several examples in mind where exceptional circumstances over the past 5 years did create political space for us to push back and to kind of have, or to work for a different approach, where questions of social justice and question of public goods delivery organized by the state and owned by the state, and the question of discipline of capital were back on the agenda. So I think just bracketing, you know, this whole macro political process under the elites will do whatever they want, and we should just accept that. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think if you look at the sustainable finance taxonomy debates, if you look at the death or near death of the social taxonomy at the European level, and the social taxonomy was explicitly designed with the idea of pushing for social infrastructure as an asset class for private finance. But these are political processes that don't simply serve the elite cannot control as easily as we think. And to me, it's important to acknowledge at least the space for political activism and pushing at European and national level, not just local. And this is my second question. I would like to know what Karel thinks about it, because to me, the idea that somehow the foundational economy can coexist with this like broader, you know, model of de-risking based that is pushing for the increasing commodification of social life and the public life I am not sure that this is the case. I'm not sure that the foundational economy can be scaled up, and I don't know what are the political processes through which, if we do little things at local level, how will this become a kind of, how will they get momentum? What are the political processes that will sustain them in order to fight back against the bigger political pressure of the new alignment between capital and the state? So it's not that I disagree with the diagnostic of the political difficulties in which we find ourselves on the left. Not that I disagree with the importance of the foundational economy. I'm skeptical about what I think is a bit of there is a danger that this is a kind of, too marginal, too isolationist in some ways, and self-defeating in the sense that the processes that are happening at national or European level will stem over this. So instead of scaling up and building momentum, you have the opposite. I think over the past 5 years, there were strategic opportunities in which the left and civil society organizations at European level could have done a better job of taking advantage of the disarray and the confusion in the European elites, and the confusion and the political pressure that came from the street, from young people protesting and demanding climate change, or demanding state action against climate change. And this was a very important moment, because for a short period of time, European elites, including the European Commission, including the European Central Bank, were prepared to be a lot more muscular or a lot more, let's say, willing to build the foundations for what I call the big green state. And I know this, talking about the big green state is complicated when you talk to people who do local activism, in the sense that, the big green state has all sorts of overtones of authoritarianism, and we can discuss those. But to my mind, when we think about the necessary transformation that the climate change or the climate crisis requires, that transformation has a series, or demands a series of political responses, and a series of the transformations of economic structures that necessarily require planning, necessarily require a state that is in charge of, redistributing resources across sectors. And I'm wondering what Karel thinks. Who is going to do this, or do we just leave it or do we just abandon it as a politically unrealistic dream that is wasting our time? I personally, I'm in kind of dreaming the impossible moment of, the Che Guevara saying that to be realistic, you have to dream the impossible. And to me, occupying the state and national and European level is still the only not politically viable, but the only political strategy that makes sense. I would wish that the foundational economy happens at local level. I'm very skeptical about the possibilities to scale it up, the politics through which this can be scaled up, when the political pressures of the new alignment between the state and capital go the other way. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. It's already food for a lot of discussion. I have to restrain myself not to go into it. But in the meantime, I think we can go to Lucía, who I'm sure has also a more practical perspective on this, coming from a social movement, then going into local office, and also having experienced Barcelona and Comú. I'm not sure yourself if you also did 2 mandates or only 1, but that you also got into contact with the reality of trying to govern on local level, and the obstacles that you also face at different levels, and how to be in contact with what you were trying to go for in the first place. So please, Lucía, share with us your experience. And so, Paul, you will put the presentation. All right.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much. It was so interesting, both of the explanations. I'm not an economist, so I'll try to give you a general overview the housing policies that we started when we arrived to City Council in 2015. And I think I'll show, or at least I'll try to show some examples of how did we spend the public money, which it was in some part European money. And I think they are examples of good practices when we are talking about housing. So if we go to the first slide, I'll try to give you before some context about the situation of the housing in Spain, in Barcelona, everywhere in Spain, just to understand what we are dealing with, or what we were dealing with. In Spain, the access to home ownership in the private market through financialization has been completely prioritized by political and economic sectors. You can see it in this figure. And at the same time, the public housing that has been built has been mainly for sale and not for rent, which is a crazy thing, and it's completely opposite of what most European countries near us have been doing. So in short, for decades, the role of housing policies has been to rely on the so-called market self-regulation and to sometimes address social emergencies through social services, and that's it. So you can go to slide 2. As a consequence, unlike other European countries, we don't have a significant and a consolidated budget for housing policies. For you to have an idea, there was a 400 million budget before Next Generation arrived, which is crazy. That was the state budget for housing policies, which is nothing. Our affordable housing stock is less than 2% in the city and in the whole state, which is, again, nothing. And of course, our rental contracts are unstable and are precarious and blah, blah. So in the city, when we arrived, there were only 7,000 units of rental apartments, public rental apartments. And at that moment, after the mortgage crisis, there was this rental bubble that was starting to grow. And that was a big problem for Barcelona because we have 40% of the people living in rents. And that's what we were facing. You can see that our public housing stock was lower than the legal touristic apartments that we have in the city in 2015, which is also a crazy number. And if we go to slide 3, that's us when we, on the right side, you can see the mayor, Ada Colau, which she was coming from housing rights movement the day that we won the elections in 2015. And of course, when we entered the city council, we knew that we wanted to prioritize housing policies in order to do a completely different thing that the previous government had done before. So we wanted to fight gentrification, fight against evictions, fight touristification, and in fact, fight against powerful real estate actors that were against what we wanted to do. So what have we done so far? In slide 4, I can show you that in terms of affordable housing stock, we have now 4,000 housing units more than in 2015, which is kind of crazy because that means that nowadays we have the largest social housing stock in Spain. Since Spanish private banks are not financing rental housing, this is important. The construction of 4,000 public rental units is financed with loans of 300 million from European Investment Bank and Council of Europe Development Bank. This is European financing, what has been helping us to build these 400 units. But we are not only building new units, we are also acquiring private buildings at below market prices. You can see in the picture of the right, I'm trying to show that we are buying all over the city, because this is a key strategy for us, because we not only need to increase the public housing stock, but we have to do it everywhere in the city, and we have a few public plots in the city and in the city center specifically. This construction has been made. In the next slide, I can show you that we are also innovating how we construct this public housing stock. We are working a lot with industrialized construction. You can see here our first temporary housing buildings made from recycled shipping containers. That was a scandal here. It was heavily criticized at the beginning, but nowadays we have won architectural prizes, and for me, most important, the residents, and they are very happy. I mean, they have positive feedback of living here. And another successful policy on the next slide, here is one of our most successful policies. It's the anti-eviction unit that was created in 2016. This is a team of 40 people that works on the ground and mediating between landlords and tenants, and giving legal counseling and social and emotional support to people that are facing evictions. And we have served more than 15,000 families. And the next slide shows that for the first time in the City Council, we have fought against touristification. We have closed down more than 15,000 legal touristic apartments, and we have approved a new urban plan that prohibits the growing of new touristic apartments. And the next slide is to talk about renovation policies, and later I will mention the next generation funds. But first, I would like to explain just in a brief way that Barcelona is a very dense city. We have, as I was saying, few plots where to build new housing, and that's why renovation policies has a long tradition in the city for decades. It's not new. But what we did in 2015 was to change the perspective on renovation policies in order to move them from a logic of universal grants to start focusing on specific neighborhoods and so with socioeconomical complex environments, because they were systematically excluded from those renovation grants traditionally. So that's why we have created different renovation programs to specifically attend those neighborhoods. You can see in the map, the neighborhoods that were selected are not in the city center, because they are the ones that were always forget, and the ones that now they have specific renovation programs. And another important thing is that those subsidies they had conditions. So they had conditions in order to extend the rental contracts and maintaining the price, in order to avoid that these renovation policies became gentrification policies. I think it's very important when we talk about renovation. And on the next slide, it's a slide to talk about a little bit the next generation funds. I think it's important to say in the first place that the NG funds have allowed the Spanish state budget goes from 400 to 3,000 million per year, which is a big change of scale. So this is a positive thing of the next generation funds, and we have to explain it, because it's the highest housing budget in the Spanish history. Of course, what we are thinking now is what will happen when these NG funds disappear. So are we going back to the 400 millions again, which is nothing to do housing policies? But another things or another characteristics that we have to talk about when we talk about next generation funds, they are the negative ones. So for us, from our perspective, we think that there's a problem with the climate criteria. So those climate criteria that are coming with the funds are responding to northern countries. So sometimes they are difficult to apply in a Mediterranean city like ours. And these funds are mainly focused on renovation, which of course it's understandable and it's good, but they are forgetting that we don't have a housing public stock to be renovated. So we need a public stock to be built. So that is important things. And again, this is a North European perspective where they have these housing public stocks. And they forget also that we have serious accessibility problems in our buildings, and there are no specific funds for that. And again, another key element that these NG funds have not taken into account is that what I was saying before, rehabilitation can be a gentrification policy. So since in Spain we have short and stable rental contracts, if these next generation funds are not conditioned or not conditioned to avoid these rental increases, we are going to have these, the rental contracts are going to be finished and the next ones are going to be at higher prices, which is, and of course, not a positive thing. Just to finish, because I think we will have time to discussion, and I have a lot of ideas that are in my head after listening to the previous presentations. But just to finish, I on the next slide, I wanted to show something that was really important for us, and that was very different of what the previous city councils were doing, and that it's connected with what the two speakers before were saying, is that we establish completely new alliances in order to work with, and some of them were these new alliances with the grassroots housing rights movements that here in Catalonia, specifically in Barcelona, in Spain, they have pushed for new housing regulations during these years. In fact, we have these new rent regulations to avoid rental increases that has been approved in Spain 4 months ago. This was, we were the first administration in 2016 asking for rent regulation, and these housing rights movements were also fighting for that. And now we have it. Now the state government has to apply it, but at least we have the law that has been approved. And another strategic alliance that it didn't exist before between the city council and the outside was our partnership with these cooperatives and social foundations in order to build and rehabilitate thousands of units in the city in the next years. Here you can see a picture of one of our co-housing units that were finished the last years, and that was the day of the celebration, when we're celebrating with the new neighbors of this co-housing. And I think I'm leaving it here so we can talk more during the discussion. I hope it's useful, since I'm not a big economy, person, but I think it's a good example of how does it work at local level.
Thank you, Lucia. I think it's very important to have both economists and non-economists to talk about the economy. So we have a lot of stuff to discuss, I think. So we do now a round. I will give each of you the opportunity to give some feedback. I just share a few points, but you can choose yourself what you find most interesting. Between Karel and Daniela, what I found really interesting was like this connection between the lower local level, community level, and the higher level, national EU level. And I was thinking, like, to have been involved in this kind of debate also since a long time, isn't there like a necessary connection between both of them, that in a way you need this local, you need to be grounded locally because that's from where you mobilize, and it's also where you can really see if a measure that has been changed, whether it's really delivering on the ground or not, and you can make sure it happens, or you at least have the most capabilities of doing it. And on the other hand, as Daniela said, the scale of the issues we have also creates a necessity to think big and to try to act big. And this also created a question for me to Daniela, where I was thinking, like, okay, you said there were several moments on which we weren't really able to capitalize. And do you have an idea why, Daniela, and or what could be better? From my own experience, like being a bit in climate and social movements for a number of years, I think sometimes that how to say, like the more broad political implications of what is going on in the macro finance, as you say, Daniela, that there's not so much there's more understanding than before, but there's not so much understanding of this. And I think that better understanding the levers and when we could have impact in what way, that this is really a bit of an issue. For Lucía, I found also the 2 points. I found this what you said about going from renovation as a point of attention, where there is quite some attention for it, to more, we need more public housing, that the more social and the ownership aspect. This is, I think it's quite interesting, and I think it's also not an issue just in the south, that also where I come from in Flanders. Also here, there's a big part of the population for which the current renovation policy will never deliver, and you have the same threats, maybe to a lesser extent, of this renovation issue. And another question also, I think, whether it's the types of EU finance that are available now, whether you think that this is enough to reach to deal with the issues. Okay, I leave the floor to you. Maybe we go in the same order. First, Karel, then Daniela, and Lucía.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the local and regional and the national and the supranational are not a binary choice, very obviously. I tried not to argue that they were a binary choice, because the last slide showed you a Venn diagram where the question is how they intersect and interact. I think compared with Daniela, I simply am much more pessimistic about the prospects of capturing or inflecting the central state or the EU. And this is, I think, a kind of political difference. And I relate that not simply to the alignment between capital and the state, but also to the increasing incoherence of what's happening. We have this recurrent crises which lead to an alternation between uncontrolled spending and austerity, which clearly is very damaging for all kinds of things, not least for the political prospects of central elites holding power for any length of time. We're in the middle of a great moving right show. This week's AfD showing was, I think, 15% in Bavaria and 18% in Hesse. So, you know, capturing the central state when it is economically incoherent and politically groggy seems to me quite difficult. And beyond that, I thought, what I responded to, I think, in Lucia's thing, is that when it comes to regional and local action, or indeed doing foundational more generally, it's not so much a question of policy choice simply. It's a question of political and social innovation. It involves putting together local alliances to do things differently in ways they haven't been done before. And therefore, in a sense, if we look at this interaction of top and bottom, I'm more pessimistic than Daniela about the possibility of influencing the top in a coherent way, hence the idea of the overlap area. And I'm also more convinced that the creative politically and socially innovative things are being done in the lower levels. Does that make sense, Frank?
Yes, it certainly does.
Karel, sorry, if I may, you didn't answer my question of what are the political mechanisms that would make your foundational approach kind of move or scale up beyond, a series of projects at local level that are, to me, as incoherent in some ways, and as, in a sense, not random, but there is nothing systematic about them.
I think that what you do need to do is clearly get EU funding, at least partly, shifted from this kind of techno shift idea of supply side intervention towards social priorities. And that's the point of the Venn diagram. I think that is attainable. And I think, for example, housing retrofit, given the failure of the Italian super bonus scheme, is really a very interesting area for experiment, because it needs to be done, because the carbon cost of new build is absolutely prohibitive. And it can't be done by simply offering cash grants to homeowners. And so it needs organization at a regional and a local level. We don't know how to organize it at a regional and local level. So I think, this is all at a level of exploring how to do things as well as what to do. And I think the idea simply that you can't spread and scale, it's both a problem and it's an opportunity for learning in some ways, Daniela, because things like managing the retrofitting of housing stock, how you survey the houses, decide on the priorities, how you decide how this relates to things like social tariffs for energy and so forth, all of this has to be, it's one way or another, worked out at the lower levels. And then please, the role of de-risking and such like could be installed in a progressive social matrix. Does that make sense?
I don't know if Frank allows me to respond to this. I mean, I still think
please go.
I don't think that you have outlined a political mechanism through which the foundational economy is not just a reactive. What I heard is a in a sense, maybe not passive, but reactive to what are the priorities and opportunities that are set at national level or at European level, and then we are strategic afterwards. This is what I heard. I don't deny that there is state capacity that needs to be created at local, super local, and regional level for things to happen. That is very true. But in terms of understanding why would we put the foundational approach as a viable political strategy that goes against what you describe as, I think you said the incoherent national project of realigning politics or the state and capital. I still don't, I haven't understood very clearly why this is, or what is the scope for scaling this up. Under what political mechanisms would this become a broad strategy with political appeal that would constitute an alternative to your description of the European model?
If Frank allows me to reply, I
would go very fast, very quick, and then we go to Lucía, and then we open the floor.
I think talk of a political mechanism is a very rationalist way of trying to understand the mess that we're in at present. Seriously.
Okay, let's go to Lucía. So
maybe from a more practical point of view, and talking about housing, when we talk about housing, we knew that, I mean, it's you cannot imagine strong housing policies without working to promote legal changes both at regional and state level. So what we did in Barcelona, which is, I think I can say it's a small example of really good housing practices, it would have been not possible without this financing from the European Union, but at the same time, it will not be possible if we don't have strong state-level budgets, what we don't have today, or if we don't talk about tax policies at state level, because today it's more profitable to speculate than to build affordable rental units, which is, I mean, it's not going to work in the future if we don't change these tax policies, or if we talk about evictions, or if we talk about rent regulation, we need to work at different levels, and that's what we have been doing. I cannot explain everything what we did, but our work to achieve these changes at these levels has been a very important thing to do, and it was different if you compare it to what the previous city council was doing. I mean, when you think about housing policies, you cannot think about only at the local level.
All right, thank you. So maybe let's see first for some questions. Aline, long time, Aline. I propose that, Aline, that you ask your question, or can we maybe take it like this? Okay, Karel, this is a question for you actually. So the question from Aline Fares is, how do you see political parties endorsing the model that you are looking at?
First of all, I think in a world of mess, talking about a model of change or a theory of change is a simplification. I think what we need are alliances for change, which would be different in various local, regional, and national circumstances. So that in some cases you could persuade political parties or coalitions to lead. In other cases, you'd be leaning on NGOs or community benefiting enterprises. In Wales, for example, not-for-profit housing associations are quite important players, and the Labour Party is quite difficult to actually motivate. But somewhere else, it might be different. And I think this also involves a general thing that, you know, when you know, I agree with Lucía. Obviously, it would help greatly to have national frameworks changed so that things were more sympathetic. But the change doesn't come quickly or in a straightforward way. Therefore, we have to deal with mess. And that's the importance of creative political alliances.
Yes. I would also, since I see that there are not directly other questions, if there are others, we will take them, of course. I would also like share a bit the way in which we are trying to, for now, to work with this, because it really kind of enriched our way of working on these issues. And I think it's what we're trying to do now a bit is also like to see like, okay, we have all these local issues but on the other hand, a general problem of this lack of attention for these basic needs that all citizens have actually, and to see like, okay, we would like to create local alliances, etc. And we're thinking about future ways of doing campaigns on this, maybe with local governments, etc. But also like, okay, how can we try to put this higher on the attention, higher on the agenda? And this goes, it's politically, but also in civil society. A part of the climate movement doesn't have these social aspects higher on their agenda. A part of the more social movements doesn't have so much in mind all the climate implications of this. And in all this, what you see on the high political level is that there is, on the one hand, a lot of concern with the growth of the populist or radical right, but that on the other hand, there is not so much willingness to look at the way in which many of the political, the policymakers are neglecting these people's needs, and that this neglect is at least one of the sources fueling this political evolution. So yeah, maybe to a long story short is what we are trying to institutionalize to put it higher on the political agenda, and I think that's it's something that we will keep on doing for the next months. So your ideas or questions and comments would be great on this. I thought that maybe Karel or
Can I
Daniela.
say that my favorite Labour Party politician in Wales says the first step is to stop doing shit, basically. And I think this is, in a situation of mess, this is quite important. Criticize the wrong priorities. Clearly, the EU's idea of putting money into shiny, shiny new tech so that everything can be the same is wrong. Clearly, the idea of the construction of health as a problem about hospitals and vaccination and high-tech medicine is wrong. And in that sense, I think stop doing shit has some force. But you then need, I think, to demonstrate something else. I mean, you know, the problem of public health in an obesogenic society is a massive one. And I think this requires all kinds of creative responses, as well as a pushback against, no doubt, capitalist lobbyists who are preventing more rational food policies. But I think to start off with, to say, you know, the way you're spending the money, your priorities under the various recovery plans are wrong. Stop doing shit is the first kind of good piece of advice. And then work out, as Lucía has been trying to work out, how you do things differently, which I think Lucía has a kind of, you know, if you want to be pompous, a performative kind of thing. You demonstrate something is different. You know, I think the business of the shipping containers I really loved, because that's a lovely example of doing something you wouldn't choose to do if you had large resources, but you did it, it was innovative, and it worked. And that's an important demonstration.
Okay, there's two more questions. One is for Daniela and Lucía, and it's like, which kind of progressive role would you imagine for the EIB to encouraging EU-level reforms, and how could we start to push public finance in such a direction?
Just a short response, because from our perspective, the EIB was very useful for us. They had this great financing conditions that we don't have in any other private bank here. And the problem, you need to think that the problem that we have in Spain is that the public administrations are not interested in go to find funding for creating social housing. They are the most of them, which are, I don't know, regional levels controlled by the right-wing parties, they are trusting in the private funding, the private market. They are not, you know, they are not interested in European funding, not even in talking about how we can improve EIB. So the problem is that it's previous. We have a previous problem here, you know. So that's why it seems that I love the EIB, but I've read the report. I know that they are not giving their money to promote housing policies, but for us it has been a very important tool.
Yeah, maybe if I can add, I think one of the things that I insist in my work is that in some ways de-risking is also a politically appealing narrative, because it kind of allows politicians to say, to do very little if they choose to kind of hide behind the excuse of we don't have the public resources, or we don't have the capacity, or we don't have the money, the conditions are not right. What we do is we will help the private sector do the things that we should be doing. And I think Lucia's example is very important to highlight that these institutions can be repurposed. The institutions that we have built in the European Union can be repurposed for the public good, where the public good in this case is social housing, if there is political will to try to tap them. So in a sense that, you know, it's of course in their DNA, it is the kind of financial sustainability is written there. And there may be an inclination to sort of work with or lend to the private sector, but even having some target, you know, like forcing the EIB to give local authorities across Europe, I don't know, even a country level, to give loans like they did for Barcelona, that already would be a step forward, because you would say to them, look, guys, okay, you do 80% of your business is you crowd in the private sector, you do whatever on whatever terms, but 20% of your resources have to go to local authorities that do public good investment. And this is usually my bottom line is, you know, between having a very bad theory of change. I agree, Karel, I don't think we have very good theories of change. We just try to force or think through, engage with change at different levels. But beyond that, we should be resisting the commodification and the project of making investable certain areas of social life. And we should be pushing for institutions or European institutions that have funding to redirect some of that funding to public good provisioning. And that is not impossible. And I think, Lucia, thank you for showing this. Maybe if I may, I will contact you to learn a little bit more, because, for example, and Karel also mentions this in Italy's case, some of the resilience funding went to support the state-owned train company. So not all of it, you know, it's not the de-risking logic, the private capital-led, you know, it's not an overwhelming, totalizing political force that kind of takes over, and we just sit here and think, oh, maybe I'll try at local level to make a little bit of change. It is possible, if you have the right political constellations, it is possible to also take advantage of the broader European level institutions and initiatives. Of course, that then I would like Lucia to reflect on why she's not in government anymore, and what does this tell us about, you know, okay, you get the EIB, you build some social housing, but still it's not a political strategy that has, you know, long-term effects. And maybe it's unfair to judge it through only this parameter, but this is how we have to ask ourselves, okay, if this is the step, what can it, why wasn't it credible enough to, as a political strategy, to convince the citizens of Barcelona to continue to support a political coalition and a political actor that is willing to do more for the local, for the foundational, or is willing to think foundationally, because I think that's what you did to some extent, right? So I'm very curious why you think, Lucia, that this thinking foundationally had a shorter political life than some of us would have liked, and all of us would have liked, I suppose.
Well, we have been in the city council, in the government. Well, we have been leading the city government for 8 years. We are a political party, which is also a social organization. We are not a typical political party. We have no, of course, funding coming from banks and from privates. And during these 8 years, I haven't commented that on the presentations, but I had to share that we have been suffering a brutal lawfare that has been driven by real estate lobbies, tourism lobbies, car lobbies. As a government, we have been criminally sued for more than 20 cases. I have 2 criminally sued because I was sanctioning a big investment fund that was breaking the law. So there has been a crazy and super strong media campaign in order to, you know, to destroy mainly the mayor, the image of the mayor, which is Ada, it's very well known everywhere. And even all this, we have been in the third position of the last elections. Only 300 votes were the difference between us and the second party, which is the typically social democratic party. The first one in the election run were the right-wing party that was saying, the only thing that we're saying was, we are against Ada Colau, so they concentrated a lot of vote. And we were the third ones, just with 300 votes of difference from the second one. If we had been the second ones, we were leading. We will be, well, we have been leading the government right now. So these days, the negotiations are going on. It's probable that we will. We don't know. Maybe we are going to be in the government in 2 months. Maybe not. It's possible that it happens. But for us, from our point of view, it was kind of a crazy miracle that we had been 8 years in the government doing the things that we did, which were really disruptive. Because there's a lot of progressive people, social movement in the city. We have a long tradition, a progressive tradition in Barcelona. So there were only 300 votes of difference. So the explanation is clear if you see the attacks that we have been suffering for 8 years. I mean, the public employees working in the city council, they cannot explain. They say, we haven't seen that before. 20 cases of criminally sued. It never happened before in the city of the history. In the history of the city. So it has been. The lobbies were they knew clearly what they were doing.
Okay, I have one question left in the chat. Somebody tells us that it's Lilian. I cannot see the last name. Says that it's difficult to mobilize things that are abstract and far away on the national EU level, and asks what could the strategy look like to put in place such a big green state, and also a bit more specification on what is it exactly, the green state. Maybe Daniela can give it maybe a bit more explanation.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to. I mean, I recognize. I'm in a radical football club in Bristol, and even my colleagues who are anarchist feminists don't want to talk about the big green state. So I recognize the difficulty of organizing around this. I would like to ask Karel instead. Give my time to Karel to tell us through, because I think the report fleshes out some of the necessities of planning and thinking through planning. To me, big green state is just a fancy term for bringing back planning at local, regional, national, and European level. The only way that we will have a transition, to me, a decarbonization or a green transition, is if the state does a lot more planning. And the report makes it very clear that this planning is a challenge, because state capacity is a challenge, because we've had 40 years of constant erosion of state capacity. And as you saw from Lucia's intervention just now, and I'm sorry to hear this, but I'm not surprised. Of course, capital doesn't like politicians who discipline it. It's very clear, and they fight very strongly against any kind of political intervention at local and national level, where the state says, you know what, you will do what we want instead of we will do what you want, which is basically how I would describe de-risking. Is okay, can we do what you want, and maybe you will give us a little bit of policy priorities in return. So I maybe Karel can take this. How do we think about planning, mobilizing for planning, or making planning great again, you know, at local level through political mobilization? I'm not sure it's possible, but I also am not a community activist.
Karel, you want to react?
Want me to reply? Well, I think Lucia's experience shows that the limits of rationalism in politics. You do good things, Lucia, and you don't get electorally rewarded. You know, we live in a world of mess, and we have to find our way through the mess, and in ways which I think require all kinds of innovation. Like one of the key innovations, clearly, Daniela, is to build the capacity of the local state to organize and to manage things. I would use management maybe more than planning, than a thing. I think we have to build capacity. We have to find new ways of doing things. And I think there, you know, the Venn diagram becomes important, because although it's difficult to change the framework, I think it is possible to get EU money shifted away from investments in shiny new technology and de-risking private capitalist projects, and towards the social priorities of the foundational economy. But as Lucía in Barcelona has found out, there isn't a silver bullet way of doing this and then getting a neat reward 5 or 8 years later.
Okay. Unless if any of you still wants to react, I think we can, maybe we are almost, our time is almost through. I just wanted to make a few very small additions. For example, Lucía, you were talking about the EIB funding you received. What we actually hear on this level is that it goes in multiple directions. On the one hand, there's like this positive experience that you have from Barcelona. It's not the first time we hear it, but it's also a question of, for example, the EIB has a high threshold. You need to have 25 million euro of a project to be able to do a project with them directly, and this is a big problem. And it's also like, so this state capacity to do it really properly, the work, whether you call it planning or management, it exists, of course, very much on the local and regional level as a result of decades of austerity, but also at the EIB, where they just very often don't have the staff to really do this work seriously, or the enough political attention to really focus on this enough. On the other hand, like in just a few discussions that we have had with different levels of policy level or inside EIB on this report, I'm not saying we're having breakthroughs or anything, but it's also there. We don't hear people who say they are against this. So who knows, we can make some inroads, even though having it really higher on the political agenda will require maybe something else than us just publishing this report. Another like final thought that really drives me a lot, and why I find this whole work on public investment so important and interesting, is that also that I think what Daniela works on a lot, and the de-risking, I think the both topics it touches here each other, is that and that maybe as social movements we can learn better this, is that in the different crises that our society faces, capital really needs this public money, and that there's a really big, also it's a narrative, and I think it still can be much more present in the conscience in social movement, parties, NGOs, whatever, that this access to public money is what the market is really wants and tries to get, and that we have really a legitimate right as citizens to say, no, this is public money. This should first of all serve our needs, and that we can win a lot by becoming more active on this scene. Anyways, I will end it here. I thank you really, all of you, very much for your contributions. It was very interesting. We will share later also, once we have finished, we will share the webinar in form of a podcast, and we will be back with you. We will later do more webinars because we will publish electoral manifesto, which is also partly based on this report, and I hope that in some way we can work together in the future. I wish you all a nice day. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to meet you, Lucía, and bye,
Thank
Karel.
you, everyone. Nice to see you again, Daniela, and we see each other again before 10 years pass.
I'm sure. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Bye.